Hi, everybody. I'm Haley here from Pro Writing Aid, and with me today is Rob Mills from Gather Content. Gather Content helps organizations with their workflow and content operations at scale. I'm going to drop a couple links about those into the chat. Rob is the head of content at Gather Content. He is a journalism graduate and has previously worked as studio manager and head of content for a design agency and as an audience research executive for the BBC. He's a published author and a regular contributor to industry publications including Net Magazine, Smashing Magazine, Content Marketing Institute, and many more. And we are so thrilled to have him here today. So welcome, Rob.
Brill. Thank you, Haley. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So my background is from design agencies, and at Gather Content we work with a lot of content teams. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to share today comes from that kind of experience of working with content teams, but hopefully the tips and the advice will also be relevant and helpful to people who may be freelancers or work by themselves as well. So let's dive in. So welcome to the show. I'm not going to talk for the next hour, but I know we've got an hour. So maybe 30 to 40 minutes I'm going to work through my slides, and I'm going to talk about the benefits of having a clear workflow, the pitfalls of not having a clear workflow or having any workflow, a step-by-step process for defining a workflow, and I'm going to show some ways that you can visualize your workflow as well with some examples. Now, part 3, the step-by-step process, is the part that's mainly for groups and stakeholders getting together, but when we come to that, I'll try and talk about it in a way where it might be for smaller people or smaller groups of people, or for people working by themselves as well. So first, a definition of workflow, of course. So Christina Halverson, in her book, Content Strategy for the Web, said that the content workflow defines how content is requested, sourced, created, reviewed, approved, and delivered. So basically, it's the stages the content goes through from the starting point to whatever the end point is that you define. And here's an example. This is one of the examples for later on, so it's a bit of a spoiler, but this is an example that we use in one of our content masterclasses for a website refresh project, and it's just the content production workflow. So you might start with a brief or a page table for your content, and then there might be researching around the topic and the brief, writing it, reviewing it, revising it, uploading it to a CMS, reviewing in HTML, publishing, and then governing, maintaining, archiving, wherever that step might be after it's been published. So of course it could be fewer stages, a lot more stages, might be feedback loops and so on, and lots of things to consider, but that's really just an example of a workflow. It's just one stage to the next, to get your content done. Again, we talk a lot at Gather Content about website content and long form ongoing content, but hopefully some of the advice is applicable to whatever content you might be writing yourselves or working with others on. So I'm going to start with the good stuff before we get onto the not so good stuff. And this is the benefits of a workflow. So really this is the why. Why do we need a workflow? Now this is a diagram that we use to talk about content chaos. And a workflow is really meant to make teams and individuals and writers be more productive. It's a process. It's a way of working. And so that's to free up your time, make sure your time is spent on the right things and not wasted. And then the stuff we've got on the left here are just some of the examples. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but some of the examples as to how time can be wasted when creating, managing, delivering lots of content. So I'm not going to read through all of them, and I am we will be sharing the slides afterwards as well. So you'll have this to refer back to should you wish to. So things like reminding contributors what they need to do. So there's not clear roles there, which is an important part of workflow. Manually updating statuses and spreadsheets, emailing Word docs back and forth, trying to find the latest content, reformatting, chasing people, copying and pasting. There are so many components to content. It's not just the creation, it's everything around it, all the day-to-day management and the operations around the content as well. So a workflow is never going to solve all of those things by itself. There's also having clear roles, having the right technology to write in, having structured content templates, having a style guide if needed. There's lots of other things, but a workflow is one element of content operations or content process that can help to make sure that teams or individuals are productive and efficient with the time, and time isn't wasted. So a workflow keeps content production and creation on track because there's a process and there's a path for getting from one stage to the next to the end. Without that, and we'll come on to some of the pitfalls, but without any process, without a workflow, things can, more easily be delayed, not happen at all. There are already lots of reasons why content may be derailed. And so not having a workflow would certainly be a big part of that, but it can keep production on track because there's a process to follow and there's a system. And you can also start to manage expectations as well, in terms of at every stage of the workflow, there should be somebody allocated or maybe several people allocated, depending on the role. And so you can start to manage expectations in terms of, this is your role within the process and the workflow, this is when you're going to be needed, this is where the contents come from, this is where it's going next, and just start to build that picture of collaboration and efficiency with everybody involved and start to manage expectations. And we're going to need you for this. And whilst this webinar is focused on workflow, I do think it goes very much hand in hand with having clear roles and responsibilities for everybody involved. And I think it's the purpose of a workflow is meant to make people's lives easier because there is a process and there's a way of doing things, and there's a shared understanding of that process. Everybody's working to the same kind of blueprint or workflow. And so if you are allocating people at stages of your workflow, manage their expectations by being clear about what you want them to do in the workflow. So if you're asking somebody to review your content, for example, you could just say, you're reviewing the content, but it might be more useful for them, and it might mean you get what you need in return. More likely, if you say, please can you review for spelling and grammar, or voice and tone, or accuracy, or just reviewing it against the style guide, etc. Try and be prescriptive, but without being overbearing and patronizing. And then you can start to understand the effort needed. So if you've got, all the stages of your workflow mapped out, and we'll be coming on to how you can achieve that shortly, you can start to see, right, often it's more of a light bulb moment as, okay, this is going to take longer than we thought. Content is often grossly underestimated in terms of the effort it's going to take to get done, because you start to see all the stages and then all the people that are needed, and therefore all the time and the resource, which often equals money as well. So you can start to understand and build a picture of, okay, the effort is going to be needed, which can raise some important questions around scope and deliverables and deadlines, which will also come up a bit later as well. Immediately even. So identifying issues for scope and timelines. If you're looking at this process and you've got all these stages and a sense of how long each stage is going to take, and then you might think, okay, we're never going to get that done in time. So is there a conversation to have about extending the deadline? Do you de-scope? Do you reprioritize? Do you do things in iterations? You can start to understand the effort that's going to be needed and the consequence of that requirement on timescales, budgets, and scope. And so I think having a workflow, you can work better together. I've already mentioned that there's a shared understanding. There's nothing worse than that feeling where you don't really know what you're doing and not everybody is confident enough to ask. And thinking about bigger content teams, we do a lot of work with universities, and they're huge organizations with hundreds of people involved in content. And so silos are very much a challenge. There are lots of silos in many businesses and many sectors. And so, for sticking with the university example, they're often not even in the same building or on the same campus. And so all these different silos, that can often mean different tools, different processes, different ways of working, etc. Even though all the people involved are likely to be working towards a shared goal and the same goal for their content. So having a workflow, having that process that kind of brings everybody together means that people do work better together. And so you create better content because the time spent is spent on what's needed. The people are motivated because they know what they need to do and when and why and how it all fits together. You're not kind of, I'll come on to the pitfalls next, but you're not kind of just trying to get content done so it's, it's just ticked off, and just, oh, we've run out of time now, so we just need to publish it as is. It allows you to focus on creating the content that has a purpose, has a goal, is written in the right style, written as needed. And so therefore it's better content. It's better for your readers, for your users, and better for your organization and your business if your content is part of that kind of setup. So better content is a bit ambiguous. What's better? It's consistent. It's consistent in terms of maybe the structure or the style. I was chatting to a university in the UK. Sorry for the higher ed heavy examples. And they said they didn't have a content style guide, and the whole kind of their processes and their technology for content. They were investing in all of that. There's a lot of work to be done as part of a rebrand, a restructure, and digital transformation. And they said that their content was inconsistent in terms of the language they were using in their marketing copy. All the subject matter experts had different styles because they had no standards to adhere to. And they admitted they had a detrimental impact on their brand. And so I think that's just a huge statement. It's great that they were able to identify that and then act to resolve that, albeit a very long-term process. But if your content is detrimental to your brand, whether that's your personal brand or whether it's a company that you work for, then that's pretty severe. And that's why content is an asset. And so investing in it by having a workflow and giving yourself the time to create a workflow is really, really quite important. And also accuracy, lots of kind of legislation and regulations, so content has to be legally compliant in many industries. So it has to be accurate. And if not, there's a legal implication for it not being accurate. That's significant. Again, that's a huge outcome of having inaccurate content. And you want it to be impactful. Again, that's a bit subjective in terms of how is our content impactful. But whether that's recruiting people, retaining people, engaging people, you want it to have the impact linked back to user needs and business goals. Okay, so the pitfalls, the not so good stuff, but still very much the why. Why you need a workflow, so you can avoid the things that I'm about to share. So if you don't have a workflow, there's just no oversight of content progress, because there's just nobody knows what's next, where are we at, what's next. There's just no understanding of the progress. That can be frustrating, it can be demotivating. It's just where are we at? How much is there to go? How much have we done? Who's it with? What are the time scales? Again, this opens up a huge list of questions when there's no oversight. But this isn't good. Whether you're an individual writer who imposes your own deadlines and you're not really sure where you're at with things, or whether you're working as part of a team in an organization and you've got deadlines and you've got budgets and there's other projects and other priorities, there's a lot of outcomes, negative outcomes, if there's just no oversight of the content progress. And ultimately, it's just not a nice feeling to have, and it's just not a nice work environment if you don't feel you've got a handle of where things are at, especially if it's your responsibility to manage and deliver the content. And so there's a lack of accountability. I've already talked about roles a bit, but if there's no workflow and there's no roles assigned to each stage of the workflow, then it's very easy for people to say, I didn't know that was my job. I didn't know I had to review that. I didn't know that the content was with me. I didn't know that, it was needed by this date, et cetera, et cetera. Again, potentially a long list of excuses, for want of a better word. And often people, subject matter experts might also be like an academic who's teaching. So content isn't their priority as such, but it's very important that they're involved in the workflow and the process, because they've got the expertise to sell that course or whatever else the content may be. So if you have a workflow, you've got a stage, then the next thing is okay, who's responsible for that stage? And so naturally it kind of brings the roles and the process together, and you've got accountability. Now, it's not to say that it's a blame game, but certainly accountability can be healthy for progress and also for the people involved as well. And so content can be delayed, or worse still, just never delivered at all. And again, that has a knock-on effect for other projects, for budgets. It's frustrating. It's all those things I've already said in terms of the team and the people involved. But again, if there's no process and you're not able to see where a bottleneck is or where the content is or where it needs to go next, it's just delayed or not delivered at all. Or you just end up going with what you've got because you have to publish and deliver something. Not a great situation to be in. And so bottlenecks, gaps, and overlaps are common. And I'll take each of these one at a time now. So bottlenecks. If you haven't got a process, it could be all the content ends up reaching John in legal Sorry if there's anyone called John who works in legal with us today. We could all be stuck with John in legal, and it may not be John's fault. Again, he may not know that it's his responsibility or what he needs to do with the content and when and what they use into write the content, etc. But if you don't have that process mapped out and you don't understand who's accountable at each stage, you're not going to be able to determine where the bottleneck is or who the bottleneck is. Or if you do, it might be so far into the project or into the writing schedule that it's already had a negative impact on things. But if you've got this process and you're able to track it, so again, you've got the oversight, and you've got the accountability, and you can see, you know what, there's like 8 pieces of content with John. Well, is it that John doesn't know that it's his job? Is it that John is already at capacity with his other responsibilities, so we actually need more people? Could the workload be shared? Again, by identifying these things, you're able to start thinking about the solutions. And if you define a workflow, which is the next stage of this webinar, hopefully you can either avoid these things altogether, or they'll just present themselves early enough that they don't derail the project and delay the content or stop it from being delivered at all. And gaps and overlaps are equally as risky. So a gap, is very much that. There's just either a stage of the workflow is missing, so the content never gets done. So if it is edit, it never gets edited, or it could be a gap in terms of an actual person again. But that's going to, if you reach a gap, then either the content's just going to skip that gap, and something's going to be missing, whether that's a certain check that you need to do. So again, it could mean the content isn't compliant. But there's, that's opening yourselves and your content up to risk. And then an overlap comes back to that clock really around the productivity. If there's an overlap in roles and responsibilities, or 2 people unknowingly working at the same stage of the workflow, then there's a duplication of work. So somebody's wasted their time. Again, not ideal, waste of money as well, arguably, and demotivated. So, bottlenecks, gaps and overlaps are, definitely a huge pitfall of either not having a workflow at all, not having a workflow that's understood by those involved, or having a workflow but not having people clearly assigned to each stage. And so, I mentioned earlier better content, but poor quality content is published just to get it done. It's tomorrow, the deadline's tomorrow. I haven't got time now to define a workflow and disseminate it, etc. We've just got to get it done. So does that mean it's draft content that's going out? Does it mean that it's content from last year? Again, it depends on what the project is and who's involved, but ultimately poor quality content is published, or no content is published. And so deadlines are missed and budgets spiral. Quite dramatic, that, I suppose, the way I've worded that there, but true. If there's no process and things are just becoming tense and everything's having a knock-on effect, and it's not just the project that you're involved in, it could be other projects that are lined up, and it all starts to, I used to work in agency, and one small bottleneck or change or issue really could have like the domino effect at other projects, right? Now we're going to have to push that back, or that's going to have to go back there, and we're going to honor that. And, again, lots and lots of issues raised if deadlines are missed. And then, another implication is that the budgets can just spiral. If you're just like, well, we have to get it done. We've promised the client or, the stakeholder, whoever it is that's involved, and then, but you're not able to ask for more money or, explain the situation, then, it's just not a good position to be in. So how do we create a process for having a workflow? As I mentioned, a lot of the stuff I do at Gather Content is with content teams. And so this workshop is very much designed around getting your stakeholders into a room for a collaborative process to define a workflow. But I hope that, if you are an individual writer or a smaller team or a freelancer working with clients, wherever you set up, for those of you who are with us today, I hope that this is still adaptable to your own circumstances as well. And I would welcome any feedback, either in the Q&A or afterwards around that. But yeah, ultimately, we're trying to run a content production workflow planning workshop, lots of P's and lots of W's. And it is to begin designing an appropriate process for the project. I say begin there because it's not just create a workflow and that's all we need to do. There could be lots of other things around the process as well, in terms of onboarding people and disseminating information and training people on the style guide and all these other things. But today the focus is obviously on workflow. And then it allows the group to explore the challenge of content production as a content team. So, I've mentioned like the shared understanding. It's so important to bring people along with you as early as you can in any process, rather than kind of burrow away and create this workflow. And it might be a brilliant workflow that's exactly what's needed. But if you just kind of dump that with somebody, whether it's like, look, I've created this in a PowerPoint, or here's a project and gather content, or however you're creating that workflow, if you just kind of give that to someone and expect them just to get on with it, chances are they're not going to, especially if content isn't their main focus. They've got other priorities, and content will be slipping down that list. So bringing people along and having a collaboration, getting them involved, letting their voice be heard and their opinions is really important. And as I've already mentioned, gaps and so on, but it'll allow you to identify those gaps and those red flags, so whether that's a bottleneck or somebody, working on too many stages, etc. Identifying them early on means you can ask the right questions early on, and hopefully start to think of the solutions early enough as well, rather than when it's too late. So it creates a moment to put content center stage in the project. And this is what we want, right? We don't want to have all these amazing designs and then be like, okay, what about the content? We want content to be an asset for the business. It has to have goals and objectives. So it has to take center stage in the sense that people understand the value of investing in content and the reason why a process is necessary around content. And so the content team are more likely to adopt their own solution, right? Rather than just tell someone this is the solution, so please follow it. If they're like, yeah, I've been a part of this, I understand the conversations we had, I was part of the decision-making process, I was part of creating the solution, then of course they're going to be bought in more than if they're just told something. And then it informs content governance. I guess this depends on the content that you're creating, but very much, with like a website project, for example, once it's live, how often do you want that content to be reviewed? Who's going to maintain it? What's the process for that? And so having these kind of conversations early on about the workflow and the process, and do we need a separate process post-launch maybe for governance? There's no harm in asking those questions early on. And so typically 2 hours to run this workshop, facilitated by the content lead. But I mean, that's, that could be lots of different people who would facilitate this type of workshop. A content strategist, a head of content, a copywriter, a content designer, lots of job titles these days. But ultimately somebody who, is responsible for managing and delivering the content. And then invite the project owners, senior editors, writers, CMS editors, if it's web content, subject matter experts. That list could be pretty long as well, but invite the right people, whether it's people from each department or certain levels of the organization, whoever that needs to be. And it might be the need to have separate workshops, if there's a lot of people involved. But book a large room, or more likely these days, organize a Zoom with wall space if you're in a room together. And breakout areas as well, like any kind of workshop or long meeting, just allow people to have a break, and hopefully it'll be a kind of creative environment. And then is it a workshop without post-it notes? I would ask. Lots of post-it notes, colored Sharpies. This is about sticking stuff on the wall if you can. There are digital tools that can do similar things as well, but yeah, I'll show a photo of a wall covered in post-it notes anyway. So stage one, mapping the production workflow or the creation workflow. The times are a bit subjective, but it's just a guideline, 20 to 30 minutes. So you just got to really think about what are the appropriate workflow steps for producing an example piece of content. I've put new site here during the project if it's a website, but it might not be. It could easily be a blog article or a landing page for a webinar, and there's lots of different content types. So if it's big enough, the group then split into teams potentially, but share like a generic process diagram as a model. So I had that one at the start, those stages for the web project. You could share an example. So again, people understand what a workflow is and what you're striving for, I suppose, even if it ends up a bit different. Give a specific page example. So, right, we're creating a workflow for a course description, right? Show a course description page. Just have that kind of visual referral point for the attendees. Share the printouts if you've got them. If it's web content, again, you could be sharing like UX designs, prototypes, wireframes, You might want to just share a content brief. If it's more long form content, share whatever you can basically to get people to understand the content that the process is for. And then use a post-it note for each stage. So literally sticking up the post-it note. This is for writing, this is for reviewing, and you may need to move them around. Sorry for the hand waving there. And then add the humans, add the people. So you've got all your stages on the wall on the post-it notes. And then you literally just like, okay, that's John from legal. Sorry to keep mentioning John. That's Tiffany, that's Hannah, whoever. And you're assigning them, it might be several people. You're assigning them to each stage. Try and make it clear by having color-coded stickers and trying to make it a bit more visual. And this is why I think this is best done as a workshop, because people are standing up and they're thinking and they're discussing, and it's collaborative, and it's just a bit more engaging. So once you've got your roles mapped along your stages, as I say, workflow and roles go hand in hand, are all the assigned roles filled? So, if you're saying, right, that's an editor, that's a CMS editor, whatever the roles are, I'm going to sit you on this loads of different ones. Are they already filled? Or have you already identified a gap? Actually, we don't have somebody to do that. Or they've left, or they're leaving, or they're seconded, or, you suddenly start to realize, oh, right, yeah, that's not quite as straightforward as maybe we thought, or maybe not going through this process wouldn't have raised that question until you were ready to go. And I was like, oh, actually, yeah, that person's not there. And is the same person or role appear in time and again? So bottlenecks, again, are you just seeing the same name mapped out? And if you do, maybe that's fine. Maybe Greg is able to do all of that, and that's his full-time job, and he's on board with it. Maybe though, Greg just has so much other stuff to do, that he's not going to be able to be responsible for all those workflow stages. Right, so what do we need to do? Do we need to take other responsibilities off Greg for the duration of the project, or do we need to crew up, for example? Start asking those questions. And then once you've got the people, once you've got the names, are they even aware that they're involved? They may not be in the room. So do they know that they're part of this process? And if not, then obviously that's a conversation to be had, or several conversations. So this is an example from one of our content masterclasses. The facilitator there shares this. And so again, I'm going to share the slides. You can always come back to this and kind of zoom in and have a proper look if you want. But you can just start to see the different color post-it notes. There's a stage for research in green. There's a stage for publish, for testing, which they've changed to web review, editing, CMS. There's a stage for liaison with designers. But what you'll also see there, well, I hope you can see it because it's not in action, it's in the kind of lighter pen that was used. But Deb's name is there a lot. So Deb is there towards the beginning. She's in Sharpie with Ange at the review stage. She's at the pre-CMS, another review there. So again, once you see somebody's name several times, is that feasible? Is Deb able to take all of that on or not? So I think there's a lot to be said for just having this in front of you, the stages and the people, and starting to see, wow, this is just one piece of content, and and Deb's got 6 things to do, and all these other kind of things as well. So yeah, so that's that would be an example of what your wall or your digital whiteboard might look like at this stage. And this is where we want to start to call out the pain points. So start highlighting and annotating any pain points that anybody in the room has identified. So again, bottlenecks. Is there a lack of skills in the team? As in, gaps, I suppose. Will there be internal politics? Highly likely. And so once you've got those pain points, whether it's a bottleneck or a gap or a lack of something, etc., stick a red dot there. Okay, so we can see we've got 6 pain points along our workflow. And again, you can start to think about the solutions and how you can overcome them. And if there's time, this is like an optional thing, which is why it's a 3A. You could there and then in the room develop ideas that could help to mitigate or smooth out the potential pain points. You could consider using software, like other content, of course, or you can start having a discussion around your current techniques. How do we currently manage this? And think about communication and stakeholder management techniques as well. So this may be something that has to happen outside of the workshop, because it's potentially a very long conversation or several conversations, but just starting to think about, okay, we've got these pain points, what are we going to do to mitigate them? Better to know that now than further down the line. And I said earlier that content is often grossly underestimated in terms of time and effort and money. So estimating fractions of hours, how much effort each step may take, and then you can start to think, right, is this realistic for our deadline, for our scope, for the resource that we've got? And it's the effort, per, again, sticking with like the website content example, effort per page of content, not the time span. So, you might have 3 days to do it, review the page, but it might only take you an hour. So it's the hour that you want to record, really, and be realistic, even if the number's creeping up and it's scary. We might have previous experience to draw on, and that example workflow I showed at the start, and I'll be showing again shortly, for the website page. In our masterclass, the example content is a university web page with around 750 words on it. No other content, no other, not a video or images or anything like that. So a relatively straightforward piece of content to go on a web page. And then what we do, we have a Google Sheet, and we have those stages of the workflow. And this is something that you may be able to do yourselves. Each column is a stage of the workflow, and then we get all the attendees on the masterclass to jump into the spreadsheet. It's always fun because it's a Google Sheet, so you get to see all the random animals that people join as. But all their names are down the side, and then we just ask them to estimate how much time it would take for themselves or their team to work through that workflow. And we get all sorts of numbers, but the average for one page is about 13 hours, one 750 word web page, which is a lot. Sometimes it goes up to 30, 40, 50 hours, some people. But imagine you've got hundreds of pages and it's 13 hours each, like scaling that up. It's huge, absolutely huge. If you don't have a process around that, then it's going to take longer than 13 hours per page. So it can be quite a scary eye-opener, but a really valuable one in terms of getting a sense of the effort that's needed. Like, content is hard. There are lots of components to content. And I think the more people that are involved producing more content, then the more risks that there are as well. So be realistic, even if it's frightening to admit it, especially if there are some bosses in the room that you maybe don't want to admit some numbers to, but it'll only be beneficial in the long term for being honest at this stage. And be cautious until proven otherwise. So, even if you're not sure, go with a higher number. And then if you finish earlier, then nobody's going to complain if they get some time back. So, be cautious. Another optional stage, just pitching and critiquing the workflow. So if you did split up into groups, then you can kind of present your workflow to the rest of the team. You might want to create a hybrid out of them, or decide on one workflow to use. Again, it depends who's involved. And you could video record the pitch, and then you could kind of watch back later. It's a chance to ask questions, and I suppose scrutinize the workflows and some of the decisions that were made. Why haven't you got any pain points, etc. And then you can wrap up the workshop. Take lots of photos if you can. It's always good to have that to refer back to, especially if you repeat the workshop. It's always good to kind of have that there. And sometimes it's just nice to look back. Whenever we stick stuff up on the wall at Gather Content, we will take the photos, and sometimes we might digitize it, etc. So it's just handy to have that reference point. If you spent a couple of hours in the room creating this, and then it ends up in the recycling, and not so good. And again, just another picture of a lovely picture of people pointing at Post-it notes. Definitely a workshop happening there. But again, just another example. It's very similar. It's Post-it notes, different colors, lots of stuff written on them. But you can start to see how that would look and how you can kind of start to critique it. Okay, so the last section is visualizing the workflow. Excuse me. And I think this is important because some people just learn better and understand better with a visualization rather than just writing down the stages. I mean, you could do that. It could be a bullet point list if that's what works. But there are ways to visualize it. I think I might have 4 that I'm going to share now before I kind of wrap up and have time for questions. So you've seen this one already on this session today. It's an example content production workflow for a website refresh project that we worked through in that spreadsheet that I mentioned. But even that, that's just a line of circles. Let's be fair, that's all it is. It's a line of circles, but I think it really gets, it really kind of shows that, right, we're going from that to that to that, rather than saying, okay, well, once you've written it, it'll be reviewed, and then it's going to get revised, and it's going to get uploaded. And it's just nice to kind of have that there. And, you might even want to change it so, whatever stage you're at is a certain color. And again, there's ways of, I guess, making this a bit more alive as the process progresses, but ultimately it's just a way of showing a workflow. And this one is from Cornell University. Again, I apologize for all the higher ed examples. It's just, it's where we've been doing a lot more work lately and chatting to a lot more higher ed content teams. But this one's really interesting anyway, regardless of the fact that it's a university, because like not all workflows are linear. Most of them, in my experience, are not. That one previously was like, right, we'll go from there to there, to there, to there, to there, A to B to C to D. But really, when you think about this with reviewing and revising, that's a feedback loop there. And it might be that there's a feedback loop going to the brand team or legal or finance or marketing. So there could be several feedback loops. So it might be going along the workflow and then coming back and along and coming back. So not always linear, and you may want to reflect that in any visualization, which Cornell have done here. They used this workflow to redesign 2 websites, their Just Given website and their alumni website. And they actually got all the content done for both websites in 4 weeks, which I just think is amazing. And it was split into two-week sections, which you can see there. So they had content creation and approval for a fortnight, and then content review and migration, and then color-coded by team. So the program areas, subject matter experts, were responsible for drafting and approval of content. Brand and comms would also help out if needed at the creation stage, but they would certainly be reviewing all of the content. And if there was an issue, it would kind of go back over the line towards, back to the subject matter experts. And then when it would get approved, it'd be reviewed again and pushed to publish and onto the CMS, onto the website. So again, they've accounted for that kind of feedback loop. They've put that in there, which I think can be important in terms of showing how the teams fit together, and that actually, those 2 stages there, approval and review, that could be like several weeks of back and forth. Which is why having a process is so important. And this is a swim lane workflow. It's from an article I wrote for Content Marketing Institute about workflow. And this is just shows the roles involved in the project or the content, wherever it might be, and how they fit together. So the content strategist is responsible for writing the brief and then reviewing the content in HTML after it's been written, images are created, it's been reviewed, it's been revised by a graphic designer and a copywriter, been uploaded to the CMS by the production manager. Then they're reviewing it, the content strategist. So they're involved at the start and again towards the end. And then it gets approved by the subject matter expert, user tested by the UX team, published by the production manager. Now I know that these roles could be very different and the tasks could be very different. But again, this is just a nice way of, I think, involving people and helping them understand where they fit into the bigger picture. So it's, right, I'm involved at the start as a content strategist. I'm gonna, they might just like step back and then get involved again when they're asked to review in HTML. But I think there's a lot to be said for them understanding, okay, it's been through these stages with these people before it comes back to me. So yeah, the swim lane workflow visualization is just another way of communicating that and disseminating it really. And this, it'd be wrong of me not to show Gather Content, although I'm not going to talk about it in detail. But in Gather Content, you can have bespoke workflows. So you can decide what the stages are. You can set deadlines for each stage and assign people. When a stage gets marked as complete, it changes color. So you've got an overview project page, and you can see, for example, not here, but I'll talk through it. So if you've got your project overview page in Gather Content, and you're looking at your course descriptions project or content, you might be able to see that 75% of the course description content is approved, ready for publishing, and 20% is legal review. Again, you can see that breakdown and that color-coded visualization, which is really important for understanding where content's at and where it's going next, where it's come from, who's involved, who's it with. Again, linking into all the kind of bottlenecks, gaps, and overlap stuff that we mentioned. So Gather Content is just another way to visualize your workflow if you're using that for your content creation. And so to summarize, and hopefully I've left enough time for questions, I think so. Workflow can help with lots of things, but the 4 key ones I wanted to kind of finish on can help with managing high volume and high stakes content. So having a process that everybody understands. And I think things like, COVID-19, I was going to try and not say that, but the pandemic lots of people had to create content really quickly. FAQs and COVID portals. Again, we saw this a lot with universities, for students and parents and faculty and staff members. They were creating a lot of content quickly on top of all the other content and then the other things they had to do. And that was high volume, high stakes content. That had to be right. Can we go to campus or not? If you don't have a process for your content, then, it's going to be so difficult to get that right and manage an already stressful situation. So managing high volume and high stakes content. Also, workflow can help with spending the right amount of time on the right things. So you're not always chasing John and Legal and etc. Actually being focused and productive and motivated. And as I mentioned, it can help keep projects and budgets on track. Because where things are at, how it's progressing, what's left, and therefore you can get a sense. Okay, we're going to come in, on time, or maybe before deadline. Actually, no, we're definitely going to be 2 weeks after deadline. And the budget implication of that will be this, so you can start to get that kind of sense as well. And a workflow helps with efficient collaboration with lots of people, again, shared understanding, shared way of working. And if you've done the workshop, then they've certainly been collaborating on defining the workflow in the first place. Yeah, that's me. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions. Hope that was useful.
Thank you so much, Rob. So we have time for questions. So if you have them, you can drop them either in the Q&A at the bottom or in the chat. To start off with, we have a couple of people who've asked about adapting this process as an individual writer. So kind of what pieces can you take? What pieces, would you leave and that type of thing?
Yeah, so I appreciate that was definitely geared towards teams. And yes. So I hope it was still useful, but I think really, I think you can just do the same, but with yourself. So just literally put your process on a wall or whether you're just writing it down and actually, even if you end up thinking, the way I do it is fine, then, I think that's still time well spent because, you kind of got a good process. But yeah, absolutely. Put your process on the wall, each stage, and start to think about, I guess if you're on your own, there might be fewer stages. I don't know. If you only got 3 stages, perhaps it's, this whole process is just not worthwhile. But if you've got several stages, it might be that you think of stages that you didn't have. Actually, I do need to check it against that. Actually, I do need to allow for proofreading or whatever it might be. So I would say, yeah, you can certainly map it out. I suppose you're not going to be allocating people if it's just yourself or very few people. But you may still be able to identify pain points. I would say that's worthwhile. Actually, have I got time to do that? And have I got what I need to achieve that, stage of the workflow? So I think it's definitely serves bigger teams for high volumes of content more. But I think that, it can be a useful, relatively quick exercise. And maybe it's better done if you're an individual writer, with the kind of estimation task as well, so you might be clear on your 6 stages for, your article, whether, starting with brief and then etc. But maybe you can start to think about the workflow in relation to your time. So, for every project that you do, record your time maybe, and then you get your average and, you can start to think of it that way. So yeah, I appreciate it's not built for individuals, but I think there's some parts of it that could maybe still bring some insights to mind that would have.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that as an individual writer, so this actually brings up a session that we had recently about, we had a session a few weeks ago with someone who's talking about finishing a book in 90 days. And she talked a lot about how just actually what you were just kind of saying about the key to finishing a book in 90 days isn't, sitting down and writing for 9 hours a day. It's figuring out where you're spending your time the most effectively. And so I think having a workflow where you can kind of triage and see, okay, what are the parts of my novel or whatever I'm working on that take a long time, right? And how can I map those then to, a place where I, when I have larger periods of time, I spend it on these. Whereas when I, things that I can, if I'm good at dialogue, I can get those out very quickly. So I think having that understanding and having that flow is really effective. And I think for all writers, regardless of whether they're working individually or with a team, at some point you're going to introduce someone else into the process, right? So even if you're self-publishing, you'll have an editor or you'll have, at the very least, a beta reader or somebody who's giving you feedback. And so kind of thinking through how those handoffs will be, when those handoffs will be, and even maybe diagramming out. So, okay, I want to get all of my first drafts done, then I will come back and edit myself, then I will draft again, and then I will hand to my beta reader who will bring back to me, and all of that. So there are, I feel like for every piece of content, again, even if you are an individual writer writing a novel, there are going to be other people introduced into the process at a certain point. And I know for myself, and I think this kind of comes to like whether you're a planner or a pantser as a fiction writer, whether you like to have a plan or not. But I know for me, if I don't have a plan, it just goes completely awry and I won't get anything done. So I think having a workflow where even if it's simple and much fewer steps just for yourself, where you're like, okay, I'm going to draft all these things first. Maybe I outline my scene, then I draft it, then I edit it, and then I just kind of repeat that. I think can be very helpful for individuals.
Yeah, for sure. I think, and the important thing is like any process is meant to make things easier. So it's not, you know, you want to be held to ransom by a process, and you know, it may be that you have to adapt your workflow for every, you know, every novel or every piece of content, etc. But I think, you know, certainly in the conversations that we have, content is misleading in terms of the effort. You know, lots of people, oh yeah, we know how we do it, and it's like, you may do it that way and the content may get done, but it might not actually be the most efficient way of doing it, or you could be missing something. And I think just asking those questions to yourself, again, even if you validate your current process, then for me, that's still time well spent, because you've got the confidence that, okay, we're doing this in the best way possible.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
yeah. And writing anything is not a linear process. And I think that's something that we can remember is writing is not a linear process where you finish your draft and then it's edited and then it's off in any sense, whether it's writing a novel again or working with a team on high volume content. And then, so that's first. And then also, I think one of the key things that Rob touched on was that these workflows are customizable. So every institution, every individual will have just as many sections or parts of that as they need to, right? So if you're an individual, you might just have 3 sections, which are like, write, edit, and then, you know, like reread, and then send to editor or something like that. You don't need to have 15, you don't need to necessarily have a budgeting section if that's not part of your content workflow.
I think it's also, sorry, just the last thing on this one.
Yeah.
I think it's, even like going really granular can be good, because it might just be that you just forget something. So for me, like when I set up like webinars, so I need content for a webinar landing page, and there are just lots of little details and components. It's very easy to forget something. And if I have a workflow stage that is, you know, confirm, you know, I don't know, book in like the run through, or, you know, check something with the slides, or will they need a poll, anything like that. Again, it's like, you know, that can be out of your head then, but it's not going to get forgotten when the time comes. So I think, you know, you can be quite granular. It doesn't have to be like review, which is like quite a big stage. That could be weeks of work, you know. It can be something that's a lot more specific, just so it doesn't get forgotten, or, you know, it just got that detail in. So yeah, like you say, customize it as you need, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple more questions. So Mark asks, may I ask what, in your experience, do most teams have the greatest difficulty with when trying to apply a workflow system?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'll try not to have like several answers, because I think there's quite a lot of things here. It's really about the people, as you know, as many things in life. The challenge is the people. I think it's just getting the people. That's why I tried to kind of reiterate a few times, like bring them along for the journey, involve them early on. It's just getting people to change their ways of working. So, you know, you can have a great workflow all set up, but, you know, it doesn't mean people are going to follow it or use it, because again, often, you know, the way that people have always done it, even if it's not the most efficient way, it can still be the path of least resistance, because it's familiar and it's what they're used to. So I think trying to get that cultural change within an organization to see content as an asset, and why are we going to spend 2 hours in a room together defining this when, you know, we've already got content, you know, out there. So obviously we've got a process. It's that cultural change, and it's that convincing people and getting them to understand the workflow, which is why I think, and it's not just workflow, it's like a content style guide. You could just send a PDF of a style guide to somebody, but I think there's a lot to be said for actually having training sessions and getting them to do exercises, and, you know, disseminating it in a way that they like digest and learn information. So I would say, yeah, certainly just getting the people to understand the value of it and getting them to follow it is the most common challenge, for sure. And it's often part of a bigger cultural change and shift that's needed.
Great. And then Mark also asks, who would you recommend in the UK to help academic institutions, i.e. a company similar to Gather Content? If there's anyone in the UK, which might be you.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, we have worldwide customers. It depends. I'm not really sure if it's like for actually creating a workflow and having like a writing platform, then Gather Content. If it's an agency who would go into like a university and help them with their content strategy, and as part of that, help them with the process, then there's a great agency called Pickle Jar Communications in the UK who solely work with the higher ed sector. But yeah, if it's like a tool for workflow, then naturally I would say Gather Content.
Yeah, and we had another question about whether you offer workflow consultancies. So Gather Content does not. Is that correct?
No, we don't. I mean, if a potential customer or a customer spoke to customer success, our customer success team, then they would be able to kind of talk to them around workflow in relation to their team and their structure and their projects and their content types, etc. So there's help there, but it's not. It wouldn't be like going into an organization and actually facilitating the workshop. I think one of the links you're sharing on my behalf is an article which is very much a written version of defining the process. And as I say, we'll share the slides as well, so that hopefully the slides for the workshop portion can act like a bit of a checklist or a bit of like a run sheet for a workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Rob. I think those are all of the questions that we have. Oh, actually, maybe one just came. Yes, okay, one additional one in the last couple minutes we have. And someone asked, are there any free tools you'd recommend to help with beginning this workflow improvement process outside of Post-it notes and whiteboarding?
That is a good question. I mean, you could use Google Sheets. Maybe, like I say, for the estimation task, we put the workflow in there. So yeah, spreadsheets could work. I know you specifically said not like a digital whiteboard, but Miro is a good tool for this type of thing as well. Miro. So that could be useful. I think that's particularly useful currently with a lot of remote like workshops happening and so on. I think there's also like something to be said maybe for just like scribbling it down as well and drawing it. I know you said not posting it, but even if it's just on an A4 sheet of paper, and any way you can get that down would be useful. But yeah, I've seen spreadsheets used in Miro. I've only ever done it. I've done it in a room with people, and then I had another team dial in on a video call. Done it that way, but that was still the Post-it note process. Obviously, a tool like Gather Content, you can put your workflow in there and do it that way. Yeah, I'd probably say spreadsheets is the most common way I see other people doing it. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Like Rob just said, I'm going to drop a number of links into the chat. So I'm dropping more information about Gather Content, an article about creating a content workflow. So like Rob said, that is basically kind of an overview of what we talked about today. And then we'll send out the slides tomorrow in the replay notes. And then I've also dropped Rob's Twitter there so that you guys can connect with him if you'd like to follow along with him and everything that Gather Content is doing. And then finally, I'm just going to drop again our upcoming events as well as our newsletter and sign up so that you guys can sign up for those if you're interested. So thank you again, Rob, so much for joining us. Thank you everybody for staying on with us through the session. We will talk to you all soon.